differences because I wanted to make some very close correlations in these reports, and therefore I wanted a very uniform group of abductees for this particular project. But I don't have any feminist agenda. The next book, which will be out next month, is called Masquerade of Angels, and it deals with one man's entire account of abduction, lifelong abduction experiences. So just because this one happens to be all on women doesn't mean I only deal with women's cases. But it gave me a homogeneous group for comparison purposes. And I'll tell you another reason it's easier sometimes to work with female abductees than with male abductees is because so much of this material is very, very intimate and very frightening, I think, more often for perhaps the male ego than the female ego. And I don't mean that at all derogatorily. There are differences between the sexes. We all know that. We have our strengths and we have our weaknesses. And it has been, in this particular case, easier to get the intimate kind of responses for this kind of study from women. And I hope that this will help open up some of the male abductees to be a little more forthcoming on certain areas that they have tended in some cases to hold back reporting. For instance, in the sexual scenarios, in the loss of control that they suffer during these encounters, and so on. Now, if you've read this book, or if you pick it up and read it later, and you see the extraordinarily complex details reported in these events, you may think these are unusual cases, and I want to assure you up front, they are not. They are very representative cases. The reason you may find these unusual is because most of the reports you've read and you've been presented on the abduction phenomena have been very censored, and they've been very partial, and in many instances they've been carried out by investigators and hypnotists who did not know to look beneath the surface. And what you got was a lot of surface reporting. And I want to tell you now that that is not where you're going to find the answers. There are levels and layers to this phenomenon within the abduction experience of every one of us who's had this happen that are covered by screens and illusions that require very thorough probing to penetrate. What I have tried to show in this book is how complex it is, and toward the back, if you get the 8 cases presented very often and very fully in first-person form rather than me telling you, I let the people tell you. And this is based 99% on their conscious recollections, not on hypnotically retrieved information so that the debunkers can say, oh, it was false memory or somebody implanted the idea. This is from their conscious lives, what they live with every day, without hypnosis. And really, that's more representative of what most abductees go through, because most of us don't have anybody to do hypnotic work with us. It's the exception rather than the rule that you find a competent hypnotist that knows how to probe these screened memories. So it does take you inside what it's like to live with this. Now I want to read you, just for a little example, a page and a half from this book. It's a prologue, and it's excerpts from 3 of these cases at 3 different times in our recent history. The first is from Indiana, and it's in 1954. And this is a quote. This is from the case of Pat. They came in our house and set up equipment in the living room, Pat said. The Army men wanted to talk to me the most. Me, an 11-year-old girl with secrets in my head. But the aliens told me I couldn't tell, because they said there'll be those who will tamper with your mind. And here they were, the tamperers, the Army men. 2 female doctors set up their gear in the bedroom, where Pat was given an injection. It made me sleepy, she said. And I lay on my mom's bed on some towels, and I told them my story. I even told them, you're in my mom's bedroom where the white glowing ones were. You don't belong here, but they do. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on this 1954 incident in just a moment. Now let's jump 20 years. Let's jump to 1978, Puerto Rico. 2 aliens took Beth down a curved hall and through a door into a different area. It looked like a surgery room, she said, and she became afraid they were going to kill her there. A third entity holding a black box, moved to a position behind Beth. She could not see what he did, but she felt as if her head was being opened and her brain removed, all without any sensation of pain. After she was all put back together again, as she said, a cold liquid was poured over her head. When this procedure was finished, the alien stood in front of her, and Beth realized that mentally she was different. Her thoughts about everything were changed, and she was filled with new ideas about God and the unity of all life within the Supreme Source. This very spiritual moment was followed by a quite physical exam, as the aliens took samples of her skin and her hair. A human-looking man with a widow's peak hairline entered the room and made a full examination of her body, including a gynecological procedure. Then he explained many things, telling her that she and other humans had been chosen to carry out certain jobs in the future. Now let's jump to Texas 20 years after that, 1992. And this is the case of Amy. Quote, "The masked alien explained that her race had been doing things to humans that they should not be doing," Amy said. She, this alien, and several groups of her race and others wanted to stop the abuse of humans by her race. They were working with certain people on Earth to stop the process. The other humans in the room were ex-pilots, military officials, and other professionals. They were all working together to stop the alien intrusion. She showed me the thing she had pulled out of my neck and said, "This implant is embedded deep in the spinal cord. The thing controlled the muscles of the body when activated. It blocked the brain and became the central command of the body. I don't want to remember how or why this thing functions." Now you get three very different, very individualized scenarios from these three reports. But when you look at the totality of what Pat and Beth and Amy and the other 5 women in this book experienced, as I spell out in a several long-page chart of comparison of detailed reports, you will see that as an individual, as each of these accounts has been, overall the pattern is extremely consistent. And I'm going to talk about the real nature of this pattern, not what you've been hearing, not what you've read, but what really is going on in this report. In this book, these 8 women come from Texas, Tennessee, Alabama, Florida, New York, and Puerto Rico. They ranged in age at the time this research began from age 26 to age 50. None of them knew the other when this began. 3 of the women are married, 4 are divorced, 1 is widowed, and 6 of the 8 have children. All right. Although there's this highly individual approach to each of these events, when you look at the entirety of the experiences, here are some of the shared details that we find in common, and all of these, I think, are going to raise some pretty important questions in your mind. First,
if you adjust the microphone, your voice is very muffled.
Is it?
Yeah,
I'm
the
sorry.
fidelity is not good.
How about this? Is that better?
You need a little bass in that mix, and I guess the sound guy, you need a little bass drum.
Can you help the sound guy?
Yeah, your battery is good.
Thank you very much.
I was just going to talk about that. Yeah. That's good. Yeah.
Very much. All right, let's start with first the nature of the contacts themselves. What do we have reported? UFO sightings, missing time during childhood, missing time during the adult phase, consciously recall scenarios both individually and with other people, virtual reality scenarios, and we're going to talk about that in some specifics a little bit later when we get to the second book, Masquerade of Angels especially, and telepathic communications. All of these constitute the kinds of contacts and experiences that abductees report. Just because you don't have them in the room touching your body, but you have them telepathically delivering information, this still is a contact. This is still part of the abduction scenario. And they vary from right in your face to remote communication to unreal, real-seeming events perpetrated mentally upon the abductees. What kind of creatures are we hearing in these reports? What are their descriptions? We get the grays. You know about the little short grays that act like they're robotic or android or insectoid in their actions that don't seem to have individuality. The little workers, and we're going to talk about those to some degree. You get insectoid-looking creatures. Tall, thin, normally very white, very skinny arms, 2 to 3 digits, triangular-shaped head with insectoid eyes. I've seen them, my son's seen them, many of you have probably seen them. I've talked to a few people here who've seen them. Reptoids, very robust creatures, normally tall, very scaly, smooth in one direction, sticky in the other when you rub over the skin pattern, clawed, webbed, and these guys have teeth, unlike the little grays. Then you get the white, humanoid-looking, not human-looking, but humanoid-looking, tall, thin, white, sometimes with very deeply wrinkled faces, with round eyes rather than the slanted eyes. And these, too, have mouths that open. When my husband was 11 months old and was abducted, he was allowed to put his finger in the mouth of one of these creatures. And he said it didn't have teeth. It had spongy, soft tissue, sort of like in a whale's mouth. You get blue humanoid-looking figures, very often reported. Not green necessarily, although those do come up, but more often blue than green. There are numerous reports of things that the abductees describe as dwarves or elves or trolls, very small, sometimes hairy, sometimes big-eared creatures. And then there's several varieties of completely human-looking individuals that show up in some of these accounts. Usually they're either blonde and beautiful, what we call the Nordic, the Pleiadian, or they're tall, very commanding, very much in charge, dark-haired humans with this widow peak hairline. Sometimes it looks artificial. Sometimes it looks even painted on. But nonetheless, those are the two most commonly reported human-looking type of creatures. But other figures turn up too in these accounts, and they're probably not what they appear to be at all when you start looking at the evidence. For instance, dead relatives are sometimes involved in these scenarios, and I'll give you one instance from Masquerade of Angels. Ted Rice, who's the subject of the book, was abducted with his grandmother when he was 8 years old. They were both given a liquid to drink. It very much altered their perceptions and their control. In fact, it acted somewhat as an aphrodisiac, and this has been reported in numerous other cases. The reptoid creatures approached the grandmother and wanted to have a sexual encounter with her. And she said, "I don't do that. I've only ever done that with my husband, and my husband's been dead 6 years, so I don't do that." Within a few minutes, they brought her dead husband into the room. And they engaged in sex. And in the middle of the sexual encounter, she realized it wasn't the dead husband at all. But the image was strong enough to convince her in the beginning that it was. Also, celebrities show up. President Clinton, Michael Jackson, Ted Danson, Shirley MacLaine. I mean, we've had all sorts of reports of celebrities involved in these abduction experiences, as if the aliens are drawing some image out of the abductee's mind that they think will make that person amenable to what's going on. And even religious figures show up, most commonly Jesus. Now, we're dealing in this country. Maybe if we were in India, Buddha would show up more, or Krishna would show up more, but right here we get Jesus. And in fact, Pat, the girl whose family was sequestered in 1954 in Indiana after a UFO encounter that abducted her entire family, the next day military personnel showed up, sequestered her family on their farm for 5 days, and interrogated them with using drugs to do so. 54. At the time this encounter took place with the aliens, Pat and her grandmother were in the same bedroom when the little grays started coming in, and they started freaking out. The grandmother especially started saying, "Oh, Jesus, what's going on?" Well, lo and behold, a little blue beam comes through the ceiling, and there's Jesus in the room saying, "It's all right, they're with me." Go. frightening, I think, more often for perhaps the male ego than the female ego. And I don't mean that at all derogatorily. There are differences between the sexes. We all know that. We have our strengths and we have our weaknesses. And it has been, in this particular case, easier to get the intimate kind of responses for this kind of study from women. And you see the extraordinarily complex details reported in these events. You may think these are unusual cases, and I want to assure you up front, they are not. They are very representative cases. The reason you may find these unusual is because most of the reports you've read, to be all on women doesn't mean I only deal with women's cases, but it gave me a homogeneous group for comparison purposes. And I'll tell you another reason it's easier sometimes to work with female abductees than with male abductees is because so much of this material is very, very intimate and and I hope that this will help open up some of the male abductees to be a little more forthcoming on certain areas that they have tended in some cases to hold back reporting. For instance, in the sexual scenarios, in the loss of control that they've suffered during these encounters, and so on. Now, if you've read this book, or if you pick it up and read it later, it's because I wanted to make some very close correlations in these reports, and therefore I wanted a very uniform group of abductees for this particular project. But I don't have any feminist agenda. The next book, which will be out next month, is called Masquerade of Angels, and it deals with one man's entire account of abduction, lifelong abduction experiences. So just because this one happened